All right, so we ended our discussion talking about evolution by artificial selection and talking about dog breeds and agricultural crops. And now we're going to start talking about sort of the Darwinian idea of evolution by natural selection, which naturally the only difference is where humans determine artificial selection by picking which individuals breed. Evolution by natural selection is where the environment determines which individuals survive and reproduce. So like I said, this was the Darwinian idea, and he had several key ideas for his theory of evolution by natural selection. The first is that individuals produce an excess amount of offspring. And then the second is not all those offspring can survive. The third is that the offspring differ in their traits, and that these differences can be passed on from parent to offspring. Differences in traits are associated with the differences in the ability to survive and reproduce. The ability to survive and reproduce is known as fitness. So, in this situation, we've had a population of these little guys up here. They're called amphipods, and they've been doing just fine. And they're this size. They're about this big. And a new fish is introduced into the population, and this fish is really good at eating these amphipods. Now, when these amphipods reproduce, 75% of them are big, and 25% of them are little. Well, the fish goes after the big amphipods. So the fish has wiped out half the population right here, and what's left for the next breeding population, the next parent generation, is 50% large amphipods and 50% small amphipods. The large amphipods are then, for the next generation, are easily picked off by the fish, leaving 75%, leaving only the small amphipods. So 75% were small, 25% were big. The fish finishes off the big group, and now all you have left is 100% small. And this population, these parents breed, and then the fourth generation are 100% small amphipods. If this natural selection occurs over many generations, the crustacean population will evolve to only contain small individuals. So while evolution by natural selection is not a random process, it's driven by the environment and driven by individuals' fitness. Since Darwin's theory, we have seen that evolution can occur by random processes. And there's 4 random processes that can drive evolution. The first is a mutation. If a mutation occurs within a population and that mutation is not necessarily detrimental, but doesn't really help either, it can still be passed on to the next generation. So in this example, we have a group of light-colored mice and a group of dark-colored mice, and it doesn't really affect, even though we have only a small amount of dark-colored mice, it doesn't really affect their fitness. And so over time, in multiple generations, you'll get more dark-colored mice with the light-colored mice, and it's not that it increases its fitness, it's just sort of random. The next random process that can drive evolution is called genetic drift. So in a large population, over time, you have the same dark-colored mice and the light-colored mice, and if the population is large enough, the proportion of light to dark probably won't change. But if the population becomes small, then just by random chance, in this population we have 60% white mice, 40% black mice, and the next generation is 80% white, 20% black, and then given enough time, you might have 100%, and the black colored genotype is now not in the population at all. So this is completely random, not driven by anything, but we call this genetic drift. Next is what's called the bottleneck effect, and we see this a lot in species that are numerous, and then maybe something happens, they lose their habitats, a disease hits or something, and then the population gets knocked down to this group right here. And this group is now what we consider the bottleneck, and this group does not contain any of the white mice. And so if this group is able to bounce back from whatever caused this bottleneck, no matter what, even if they have a ton of individuals, the white mouse genotype is lost in the population because of the bottleneck effect. And last but not least, similar to the bottleneck effect, we have what's called the founder effect. Where you have a mainland group of mice and, on a large land mass, and somehow a small segment of that group makes it to an island. Well then, if that small segment doesn't contain any brown mice, like it does in this example, well then on the new island you'll have mice that are white and black, but there will be no brown mice in the new population. None of that genotype will be expressed in the population. So those 4 processes are completely random versus natural selection, which is not random. Next, we'll talk about speciation. If you remember, speciation is evolution in which a new species arises. There's 2 types of speciation. There's allopatric and sympatric speciation. And this type of speciation, we have, this is a demonstration of allopatric speciation, where we have an original population of all these mice in a field, and then for some reason a river comes right through and splits the population in half. Now, for whatever reason, these mice can't swim anymore, and so over many generations, these mice evolve into 2 separate populations. Now, even if, and eventually over time, these 2 populations become genetically distinct from one another. So even if the river dries up like it does right here, and these 2 populations come back together, they cannot reproduce and produce viable offspring. So from where there was 1 population here that could reproduce and produce viable offspring, you now have 2 genetically distinct populations. The keys to allopatric speciation is geographic isolation that leads to reproductive isolation. So that's the key. It's geographic isolation, which eventually leads to reproductive isolation. So that's allopatric speciation, and one of the most common examples of allopatric speciation is Darwin's finches. There's a common ancestor from the South American mainland, and this common ancestor made it to the Galapagos Islands and were able to speciate out because they became reproductively isolated due to geographic isolation from the common ancestor. Now, for sympatric speciation, this is speciation that occurs in the absence of geographic isolation. Most of the time, this happens through what's called polyploidy. So, most organisms are diploid, and sometimes when they reproduce by random, an extra chromosome, extra pair of chromosomes can be present in the offspring. And that, in and of itself, since you have a whole new group of genetic information, you have officially created a new organism. And we do this a lot in agriculture. So we have the inkhorn wheat over here and the durum wheat over here, and every once in a while you'll have polyploidy individuals, which will give you bigger grain. And we can control this in the lab, and we can create wheat that has that's its own species, has its own unique set of chromosomes. It has more chromosomes than the durum wheat or the inkhorn wheat, and it creates bigger grain, which we like, so we can eat. So this is an example of sympatric speciation, the creation of this new species in the absence of geographic isolation. So now a little bit about the rate in which evolution can occur. In Darwin's time, he had the idea that we would never be able to see evolution by natural selection happen within the human time scale. While that might have been true during his time, during our time, we have seen evolution occur at a human time scale, especially in terms of viruses like the HIV virus that we looked at in the video. The normal rate of evolution is a new species about every 3 million years, but we have some instances like this lake in Africa, which 200 species of cichlids have evolved over a period of about 7 million years. So depending on a lot of several factors, evolution can happen really, really slowly, or they can happen relatively quickly. Now, the way some factors that determine how fast evolution occurs, or the ability of a species to adapt to change, include these 4 factors right here. The rate of environmental change, and basically this is showing a simple relationship. If the rate of environmental change happens quickly, then the species aren't giving enough time to adapt, and so evolution will happen slowly. There's a lesser of a chance of a species to be able to adapt. If the environmental change happens at a slow rate, then there's a greater chance that the species will adapt to change. As far as genetic variation goes, the less genetic variation there is means less of a chance for the species to adapt to changing conditions, where if you have more genetic variation, there's a greater chance the species can adapt. This one is kind of counterintuitive, is population size. A small population size is beneficial in terms of ability of a species to adapt to change, because mutations, a beneficial mutation, can spread more rapidly in a small population versus a large population. And last but not least is generation time. Short generation times will increase the chance that a beneficial mutation will happen given the amount of time and allow them to spread throughout the population faster. This is specifically true, or especially true of the HIV virus. They have short generation times, and so they can adapt to the changing body conditions a lot easier. All right, so if evolution creates new biodiversity, well, extinction decreases biodiversity. There have been 5 mass extinctions within since in geologic time. This was the greatest one right here, about 251 million years ago, where over 90-something% of all the species on planet Earth died out. And this is the one we're probably the most familiar with. This is when the dinosaurs died out. Scientists have come to the consensus that we are in the midst of a 6th mass extinction, and the only difference between the 6th mass extinction we're currently in and the 5 in the past is that this mass extinction is largely attributed to human causes. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. Now, all species have a range of tolerance in which they can live. This is called the fundamental niche. And so you think of a certain factor like temperature, and right here is the perfect temperature for a species to survive, grow, and reproduce. If the temperature is a little bit too hot, they can survive and grow, but they might not be able to reproduce. And the temperature is super duper hot, they can only survive and they cannot grow and reproduce. And so the fundamental niche is where all species are trying to get to, and where they actually get to is called the actual niche or realized niche. And that does it for the main concepts in Chapter 5. Please let me know if you have any questions as you prepare for our test on Friday.